everybody, and welcome to the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. I'm Alan Abbey, and we welcome you to tonight's Rabbinic Holiday Webinar on Hanukkah. Tonight's program features Noam Zion, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute, with a talk entitled Bringing Truth to Light. Noam Zion is a longtime teacher at the Hartman Institute, an expert on Hanukkah and many other holidays, and we're very glad to have him here. It's been 5 years since he's been with us on this program, and although I didn't know it 5 years ago, this is right around his birthday, so tonight we'll wish him a happy 70th birthday. You're watching tonight's program on the Hartman Institute website, on our Facebook page, on our Twitter page, and on our YouTube channel. So I hope wherever you're watching it, you're going to be able to have a good experience with it. And now I'd like to bring to you Noam Zion for tonight's program.
Okay. Tonight we have a mixed audience. On one hand, we have the rabbis, the Hartman rabbis that Lauren Birkin organizes so beautifully. On the other hand, Alan, our PR person, has brought us also a group of journalists, and I hope the topic will relate both to the journalists and to the rabbis. The topic I've chosen is to try to take a look at bringing truth to light. And of course, there are many concepts of truth. I'm going to talk about 3 different notions of truth that can be related to Hanukkah in general, and perhaps also 3 different ways that one brings truth to light and what its effects can be. So we start, of course, with the fact that Hanukkah is about both the past, Bayamim Hahem, and also about Bazman Hazeh. And constantly when we're reading the past events, we're going to read them through, of course, the context and the lens of what we think is happening now. If Hanukkah were only about the historical past, it wouldn't be worth celebrating. And because it's constantly having to be fit to the present, Hanukkah is constantly being reinterpreted. So the moment we're at is literally an incredibly dark moment. Perhaps not for you because you're in the middle of your day, but certainly in Israel, the sun has gone down a long time ago. And we're precisely at the moment of the greatest darkness, first of all, in terms of the solar world, right? We're very close to the, especially, even though this year a little bit less, very close to the winter solstice. We're also at the darkest point from the lunar point of view, caught between the end of the previous month and the beginning of the new month when there's barely a new moon around us. And that darkness, I think, has also been understood properly as reflecting also the political darkness. The political and religious darkness was clearly dominant in the times just before the Maccabean revolt began with the persecution under Antiochus IV. And I think it wouldn't be hard for many of us to feel that we're entering into a dark time in general, dark time in the Middle East with the threats from Iran, with the changing politics, clearly a dark time understood by many in the United States, a period in which the assumption that enlightenment, that natural, secular, and knowledge progress will lead to greater light in the moral sense, in the objective sense, there's a deep sense that perhaps enlightenment doesn't lead us always in a one-directional way. That period of darkness. And of course, specifically because of the events only of a couple of weeks ago in Pittsburgh at the synagogue, which is the synagogue of Lauren Birkin's father-in-law, the terrible slaughter in Pittsburgh. And that certainly adds a terribly dark element to us, especially for those of us who are rabbis and who work in congregations or daven in congregations. My understanding, one understanding of what happened in Pittsburgh is very much influenced by an article that my son Michel Zion wrote, in which he suggested that instead of looking at the victims in Pittsburgh as the victims of random terror, or looking at them even as the results of a false ideology of anti-Semitism, instead of looking at them as victims, look at them as martyrs. Martyrs who in some sense, in a terrible sense, were chosen correctly. They were chosen correctly by the man who decided to kill Jews because he thought Jews are identified in some way with a more liberal approach toward refugees. Without deciding what political party you're in, the Jewish people, certainly American Jews, are very strongly identified with a concern for how refugees are accepted and absorbed, and clearly, of course, for religious freedom in terms of what kind of refugees can be accepted or not. So in choosing to kill people from a politically liberal conservative synagogue in Pennsylvania, clearly in some sense, he was responding to values that these people really did represent. Whatever, I'm going to try to play on that theme of martyrdom, the theme that both in death and in life, people are sending out a message by their own lives and sometimes by their deaths, that they're sending out a light into the world, is clearly one of the notions invented basically by the writers of the book of Maccabees, the first book to describe religious martyrs in the history we have of human beings. At the same time as it's a dark time, it's also, we're celebrating the beginning of a transformation. The beginning of the transformation in about a month will be, of course, as the sun begins to get stronger in the northern hemisphere, as the light begins to increase. Also, of course, as we move towards Rosh Chodesh, as the sun increases. And here I would quote Rabbeinu Bachya, who says, Ha'or doche harbe min hachoshech. Even a little bit of light can chase away a lot of darkness. Some light can expel much darkness. That doesn't mean we can get rid of the darkness at all. This is not a holiday that celebrates the end of darkness. It's a holiday that celebrates the beginning of a struggle to increase light precisely at a time of tremendous darkness. So perhaps as an example of that, if you'll take a look, and I hope you did print out the sources or you have them available before you, on the second page we have a picture of a menorah from Kiel, Germany. It's a menorah that I used in the Hanukkah book that I produced, A Different Light. And it's a picture in which you see a menorah in its classical position in Europe, that is, in the window. And if you look at the public space that it's sending its message out to, it's a public space with the flag, the Nazi flag, from 1931, when the Nazis in the 1930 and 1931 elections got their highest number of voters, higher than in 1932 and 33, and in which the municipality in Kiel was captured by the Nazis, and therefore they began to dominate the public space. So the Rabbi Posner and his wife Rachel, who put this menorah in their window, were clearly trying to say, we're making a message about our identity and our values that we're sending from the private space into the public space. And in fact, Rachel, the Rebbitzin, wrote on the back of this photograph, their flag, the Nazi flag, seeks the death of Judah. But Judah will survive, and its light will overcome their flag. Here a reference to Judah, the tribe of Judah, to the Jews, and perhaps also because of Hanukkah, to Judah the Maccabee as struggling to shed his light on the world. And in fact, we know that that's one of the unique ways that Hanukkah is celebrated. It's celebrated as a holiday, not a synagogue holiday, and not a public holiday, but a private holiday. A holiday not of the individual, but of the home. Ner Beito, there needs to be actually on Hanukkah only one light, not 8, not 2. One light would be enough. That one light is the light of that house, and it's a light that you put in your window to shape from the private space to influence the public space. It's a liminal moment. And so, in fact, my theme, bringing truth to light, is reflected in the halachot of Hanukkah, which you have in sources marked number 1 from Rambam, who really summarizes many of the mitzvot, and he shows clearly the notion of pirsum. Pirsum, which means to publish or to publicize, is in fact a Greek word, showing that the integration between Jewish rabbinic culture and Greek culture was never a one-sided matter of rejecting everything Greek and accepting everything traditional and pre-Greek, but rather there's an enormous amount of integration. So the rabbis, taking the word pirsum, related to parhesia, the public, talk about the way in which Hanukkah candles have to be structured as a good form of advertising. In modern Hebrew, the word for advertising is pirsum, and Hanukkah is about advertising. It's advertising the message that comes from outside the house, the message that comes from inside the house, in order to shed that light on the public space as such. And therefore, the rabbis are so concerned that the lighting of the Hanukkah candle should happen at the moment that people are still in the public space. Therefore, the ideal time to light Hanukkah candles is not at 10 at night and not at 9 at night, but just at that moment when people are coming home from work. They're still in the streets, but already the family has put a light in the window. It can be in the window, it can be out in the courtyards, the way it often is in Jerusalem, usually in glass containers. And there's a problem here if you live on a high floor, because the Chanukiah is not supposed to be above 20 cubits, because a person walking along the streets doesn't look up more than 20 cubits, and therefore they wouldn't see it. It has to be visible to be a good form of advertising. And then there are many, many other laws associated with that notion of publication. And therefore, if there's nobody to see your Hanukkah candles, it's not clear that they serve the function of publication towards the outside world. But at least, even if it's late at night, and even if you have no access to the public space, it still serves as a form of pirsum, of internal pirsum. And in the times of persecution, when the Jews, for example, under the Zoroastrians in Babylonia, could not put their Hanukkah lights in the window because the Zoroastrian religion of fire, therefore, the notion of publication and education became an internal one. It still has a value. When I was in the United States a couple of weeks ago, immediately after the terrible Pittsburgh martyrdom, as I call it, there were many signs, not from this period, but from an earlier period in Princeton, and the signs had the following statement. It said, "Hate. Hate has no home here." And then it was translated into Arabic and into Hebrew. What's interesting here is the notion that our house, not that our house becomes a source of light that's shed on the outside world, but rather that our house has to protect itself by not allowing the public space, a public space that has become quite venomous and toxic in the attacks on various positions. Our house won't allow that hate to come in and infect it. The notion of having these signs, which have a heart sign with a stars and stripes on it, and the statement, "Hate has no home here," is sponsored by an interesting organization, which from the website tells me, creating communities of hope, one sign at a time. It was in fact invented in a neighborhood in Chicago, which is a mixed neighborhood. It was invented in part by a kindergartner and a third grader, and then the parents took over in order to try to make it into a public campaign. Now, the three kinds of truth that I'd like to talk about are the following. One is the truth, particularly important for journalists. It's about objective truth. It's about distinguishing truth from fake news. It's about trying to give us the necessary tools you need in a democratic society, the knowledge you need in order to make decisions. It's a truth which is about an expose, to bring truth to light when there are many forces trying to cover up that truth and to delegitimate that truth in one way or another. The second kind of truth that I like to talk about bringing to light is a missionary truth. It's a salvational truth. It's a truth that guides one's whole life and brings one to the sense of being redeemed from darkness. I was in darkness and now I'm in light. And the third one is the notion of a bringing truth to light, which is not bringing the truth to light, the salvational truth, and it's not bringing the objective truth to light. It's about bringing your own subjective partial truths, the truths of your community, and having them added to the marketplace of ideas that are out in the world. It's a statement about, this is my truth, and I want other people to know about that truth, not necessarily that I want to convert them to my truth as if my truth were the only truth. Let's start with the democratic notion. You have it on source number 2, which is entitled Speaking Truth to Power, of course borrowed from the Quaker tradition, in particular from an article in the 1950s during the height of the Cold War, in which there was a nuclear armament was the central theme, and in which violence was seen as the only way in which we can maintain the West as opposed to the communism. And there they published articles in favor of looking for nonviolent solutions, which they called Speaking Truth to Power. Clearly, their point was to have an influence on the public discussion. Now, if you think about the notion of a democracy, and you'll see how I think this is related as well, a democracy is about lahotzi la'or, publishing. That's the Hebrew word. The modern Hebrew word to publish is to bring out into the light. And in a democratic system, we need governments that have power and that have good reasons for hiding the truth or creating their own propaganda forms of truth to create a system of checks and balances of criticism. Without knowledge, of course, there's no way to maintain that. Now, In the case of the Bible, right, and in the period of the rabbis, we clearly do not have democratic regimes. But we do have, all the way in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 17, we have a very strong notion, an ideal notion, of a constitutional monarch who is subject to the law, and therefore subject to investigative techniques to find out whether he's living up to the law, in which the king is an office holder. He doesn't own the state, he's an office. He has enumerated powers. And according to Deuteronomy, he does not have legislative powers, he does not have judicial powers, he doesn't have priestly powers, although King David and Solomon do. And the Deuteronomic king is the one who studies the law, who reads the law, who writes his own version of the Torah, sort of carries it around him with him everywhere, the way the Supreme Court Justice Blackmun, Hugo Blackmun, I think, if I remember right, used to carry around a copy of the Constitution in his pocket. And I know many rabbis who have a whole Tanakh in their people don't have Blackberries anymore, but whatever those things are that we carry around information. And it seems to me that in the book of Samuel, we have really an early version of the Federalist challenging the danger of the corruption of the concentration of power brings. And therefore, the notion that even the king chosen by God, by the prophet, by the fact that he's chosen or she is chosen by the prophet and by God, that means that their mandate is subject to that kind of criticism. And of course, who are the investigative journalists, the Woodward and Bernstein of the Watergates of the Bible? Of course, it's the prophets. They're the ones who have the inside information. And they're the ones, in the case of Natan the prophet, who are challenging King David, who's involved in a vast cover-up when he is accused of a Me Too crime, of exploiting his power in order to have sex with one of his soldiers' wives. And the uncovering of the truth is essential. You have that, of course, with Eliyahu trying to uncover the truth between Izebel, who has corrupted the judicial system by bringing false witnesses in order to convict Navot and to take his property. So I would suggest that one of the important things about the roles that we all have in bringing truth to light, and clearly in an age in which we send around messages that we receive from time to time, we are active journalists looking for truth and trying to spread it to people on our own, is that the greatest threat, I would say, to truth is not the absolute power that corrupts, but actually it's the partial power. It's the power of people like King David and like Ahav, who saw themselves as Jewish kings, therefore subject to the Torah, and very much concerned about public opinion about what they had to say. In fact, David never would have had to kill Uriah in order to take Bathsheba if he had absolute power. It's only because he was worried about his reputation. And Machiavelli teaches us how important it is, even for the monarch, even for the prince, to worry about the public opinion. And therefore, the tremendous importance of the journalist and the prophet in order to keep the king honest. The journalist and the prophet are not, for the most part, revolutionaries trying to change the system. They play a role in accepting the awe of the office and the power of the office, but keeping that office true to its own purity, to its own mandate as such. This is not directly to Hanukkah, except in the sense that once the Maccabees got their own power, they also needed to be criticized from the outside, very much by the Pharisees, as their power also tended to become more absolute and more exploitive. But the later Maccabean Hasmonean kings are not our topic for tonight. Let's take a look, if you will, in the sources of number 3, Antiochus Epiphanes. Here we're looking at a different kind of a truth, a salvational truth. So in fact, I think the New Testament represents it very well, and I quote, "So Jesus said to the Jews who believed him, 'If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.'" The assumption is that you live in a world in which the truth is hidden, and the task of the missionary is to bring that truth to people, and that truth totally transforms their world. We're not talking about an objective truth that allows you to evaluate things better or worse in checks and balances. We're talking about a tremendous vision that transforms your life and often turns you into a missionary to spread that truth to other people. In the famous Amazing Grace gospel, I once was lost and now am found, was blind and now I see, which, at least from what I've read, is attributed to a former slave trading captain who then, when he saw the Christian light, repented from how he had treated the Africans, and he began to see the light and preach that light. So there's a kind of truth which is just opens us up in a total way. And I think that's a good way to understand, not the Maccabees actually, but Antiochus. Antiochus IV, who was a Hellenist king, descended from some of the generals in which Alexander the Great, when he conquered the whole of the Middle East all the way to Persia, even partly to India. And afterwards his kingdom was divided into three, and the Seleucids, the dynasty of Antiochus, who were located in Syria and who were Syrian Greeks, they ruled over this whole large area by the establishment of Greek polises, in which many people who were ethnically not Greek, but they became Hellenists, and they adopted the Greek way, the Greek culture, the Greek political system, and they were the key sources of power, while the traditional cities and villages were subjected to colonization by these Greek city centers. And here I think the use of the language of imperialism and colonialism, and calling the opponents of Antiochus the anti-colonialists and the anti-imperialists, suggests some very significant parallels to some of the politics we have going on today. Now, Antiochus IV was different than the previous kings, and we can see that, first of all, by the fact that he's called Epiphanes. So the great Jewish historian Elias Bickerman of this period, he talks about how Antiochus is one of the kings who shifts the essence of Hellenist religious belief, and he puts an emphasis on Zeus. So much so that when he produces coins that show an image of Zeus, and you look at the facial features of Zeus, you can see they are the facial features of Antiochus IV. He's called Epiphanes from the word, from an epiphany, because he himself is a source of divine light. The Greek kings, the Hellenist kings, saw themselves as being divinized. And therefore, the rays of the sun went out from his head because he was the source of the sun, the source of light, and therefore the worship of the sun, which was very much associated with Saturnalia, the 8-day holiday that happened around the time of the end of December at the moment of the winter solstice. He emphasized that holiday very strongly. Now, one of the things he pushed was that not only would Greek cities that he established, and he named Antioch, in which there were many cities named Antioch, but he began to get traditional cities to transform themselves into Antioch. And here we see the specific situation that the Maccabees and before them the martyrs had to face. And so if you take a look at some of the sources from the Maccabees, Maccabees 1, again on sources 3b, you see that there were a group of Hellenist Jews who decided that they wanted to Hellenize their Judaism as much as possible for political, for economic, for cultural reasons. They're the ones who specifically asked permission to change the constitution of Israel, which had been the constitution from the days of Ezra based on the Torah, to the Greek constitutions, to change citizenship from the citizenship of all Jewish males to the citizenship of only those who'd gone through gymnasia education for the aristocrats, and to remove the marks of circumcision and to abandon the Holy Covenant, the Torah, which was their constitution. And so part of what the Maccabees were up against was a belief in humanism, a universal humanism, a very intolerant humanism, a sense of truth that thought that anybody who wasn't a Greek speaker was a barbarian who had no truth, and it was their job to bring that truth to people whether they liked it or not. The Greek historian Diodorus, in source number 4, just the first line is very powerful. Since Epiphanes was shocked by Judaism's hatred directed against all humankind, misanthropy instead of philanthropy, he set out to break down their traditional practices. And he describes how he has all of these books that are preaching xenophobia the Torah destroyed. How he takes the altar and he has pigs sacrificed on it. How he forces people to partake of the meat of the pig. In other words, it's important to see that very often the people who speak in the name of humanisms, whether the humanisms have the communist form or they have the Hellenist form, that they have a language of universalism which is the basis for the oppression of the particularisms of various different cultures, in this case also Jewish culture. And that part of their description of Judaism as being racist, as being xenophobic, is in fact an important part of their form of oppression. Now, if it doesn't work by educating people, which was worked for the elites, it does work, of course, it can also work through oppression, through forcing that notion. And therefore, in source number 4, we brought the famous description of how Antiochus issues a rule, a decree to all the nations in his empire to abandon their own customs and become one people. Again, this is not about anti-Semitism narrowly, it's not about the Jews specifically, it's about a vision that the only way to bring all people together, if I may quote John Lennon in his I Imagine poem, is if we get rid of nations, we get rid of religions, we get rid of classes. It's only by the total homogenization that we can talk about an ideal world. And there's a tremendous appeal to that notion. And there's also an element that in that notion of humanism that totally rejects anybody who disagrees with it. And I think that polemic between having the truth, painting it as humanism, and then totally denigrating anybody with any particularism of their own is an important theme to think about in terms of its application today. I won't try to be that interpreter, however. Now, one of the things that's important in the ways in which they forced this humanist Greek religion on people was, and you can see that also in the Maccabean sources, is that they forced everybody on their doorsteps in front of their houses and in the streets to burn incense in order to celebrate Antiochus' birthday, to celebrate the holidays that they had in the month of Kislev, in the month of December. And the height of all those holidays was on the 25th of the winter month. That's Saturnalia. That's the celebration of the beginning of the winter solstice and of the sun's victory as the sun begins to get stronger and the days longer. And it's exactly at that time that any Jews who continued to circumcise their children were put to death, with the mothers being put to death at the same time in the most horrible possible fashion. Remember where the incense was burned on the doorsteps in front of the streets. Now, I think it's important to see that what Hanukkah is about, one legitimate historical reading, but not the only reading, is that the Maccabees are an anti-colonialist effort, a traditionalist effort to fight back against Greek humanism, which would become, that not only forced itself on people educationally, but also forced itself on its people through totalitarian activities. And here, for good reason, a lot of us have a problem with the Maccabees, but let's understand them. In source number 5, in the 3rd paragraph, in which the king is forcing in the town of Modi'in, forcing Jews, or encouraging, sorry, not forcing, creating a situation in which it's hard to say no to joining in the sacrifice to Zeus. And the king offers the chance to be the friend of the king, a very high status in the Greek Empire. And it's at that moment that Matityahu, who because he's a priest and an important fellow in this town, is asked to participate. And Matityahu answered, and he said in a loud voice, "Even if all the peoples in the king's dominions listen to him and forsake each of them the religion of their ancestors, and I and my children and my siblings will live in accord with the covenant of our ancestors. God forbid that we should abandon the Torah, our constitution, and its ordinances. We will not listen to the message of the king, nor depart from our religion to the right hand or the left hand." It's at that moment when Matityahu refuses to be a quisling It's not only a question, of course, of faith, and certainly not a question of religious freedom for the individual. It's a question of imperialism using religion and culture to reinforce its own power. And so when a Jew does get up in order to gain the status of friend of the king, Matityahu stands up, compares himself to Pinchas, kills the Jew, and kills the soldier, the Greek Syrian soldier. And then he says, Mil Adonai Eli, quoting from Moses in the battle against the golden calf. And they go off into the mountains, where they begin, of course, the revolt, which is the Maccabean revolt. They would also, of course, go into the towns where Hellenist Jews, or Jews who simply wanted to be accepted into society and not be persecuted, had not circumcised their children. That would have been too dangerous. And they forcibly circumcised the children. So we see here a complicated situation. Matityahu is not fighting for individual religious freedom, but he is fighting for collective religious freedom, the freedom of traditional groups within the Greek Empire in order to maintain their own individual religion, culture, language, their own loyalty to their ancestors. Without being xenophobic, they wanted to be true to their own ethnicity. And I think we have to think about that because it's a constant problem whenever ethnic groups are struggling for their own freedom and their own rights as ethnic groups and as religious minority groups. If you're a member of that ethnic or religious minority group, it used to be true for Jews as well, there's tremendous pressure on you to carry the line of your ethnic and religious subgroup. And if you decide to make yourself like the majority, then you have sold out to the imperialists. You've sold out to the WASP culture, if you will, of each time that majority view takes a different position. And we have to think about that, about the tension between individual freedoms and the notion of collective freedoms, in which you have to struggle to maintain the borders on your collective group, and you put a lot of pressure on people who are not willing to maintain their loyalty. In fact, you have many people policing the borders of that loyalty. Needless to say, there are plenty of Jewish examples today, examples in Israel, some of them getting into becoming political laws. They consider, for example, the law that seems that it's not going to pass in order that the government give no financial support of any sort to any non-Zionist, let alone anti-Zionist cultural expressions. They don't forbid it because they accept freedom of expression culturally, but they don't want to give any government support to it. The notion of policing boundaries all the time, especially among a group that feels that it's a threatened group, right? And Zionism is certainly seen as being threatened by the Israeli government and by plenty of Jews. If you look among people who are strong supporters of what they call their understanding of human rights, they also see quite critically Zionism and nationalisms of all kinds. So that's a complex issue, and I think Hanukkah raises the issue without helping us to solve the issue. Let's go now to our last notion of truth. And here, this is not truth as a salvational truth, but rather truth as a particular truth. The truth of a particular identity. I think that's what Matityahu is talking about in his speech. And here, the way you bear witness to truth, in fact, that is the meaning of the word martyr, a good Greek word. It means to bear truth, to bear witness. The Aramaic one is sahaduta, as you may remember from the story of Lavan with Evan Sahaduta, which is close to the word shahid, as in the understanding of radical Muslim terrorists, not as terrorists, and certainly not as suicide bombers who are in despair, but rather as people bearing witness. And that's the notion of edut. Our job in the world as Jews is to bear edut to the world, to bear witness. That, in fact, I think, is the core notion of Kiddush Hashem. And therefore, to understand Hanukkah, then, is to understand both the roles of the martyrs before the Maccabees' successes militarily, the martyrs who are described in the book of Maccabees, as well as the martyrs who are the martyrs or the fighters in the case of the 5 sons of Yehuda Maccabee. Now here, in fact, that description of in the book of the Maccabees of Elazar, who was a Jewish philosopher, or of an unnamed woman with her 7 children who all refused to bow down to Antiochus, and each one of them is killed in a more bizarre fashion until finally the mother herself commits suicide. All of them are the first time in history we have people who can choose to bear witness. When you're being persecuted for your religion or your ethnicity, that's not being a martyr. It's only when you have a choice that you can choose and opt out of it. You can move from your ethnic identity to a Hellenist identity, from being a Jew to taking on another religion. When you choose to maintain your loyalty, then you're really bearing witness. The book of Daniel, at least the second half of the book of Daniel, which is describing the martyrs, Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah, and Daniel, martyrs who in the end are saved by God. Many scholars think that part of the book of Daniel is written during the period of the worst persecutions under Antiochus IV before the Maccabean revolt. In each case, the power of those stories is not in their physical violence or in their physical opposition to Antiochus. It's in their bearing of speeches, philosophic speeches that define what I represent as I die at this moment, and a belief that in the end, my truth will be the truth that comes to dominate. Right? And so Maimonides, in source number 6, he talks about the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, that we should be willing, if necessary, to allow ourselves to be killed. It's not about suicide, right? In order to maintain our truth. Now, for Maimonides, as a rationalist, as an Aristotelian philosopher, as a monotheist of a very specific kind, there is a rational universal truth, and Judaism's monotheism has that truth. And therefore, for him, as martyrs, we're spreading the truth as missionaries. But I don't think that's the only way to understand Kiddush Hashem. Certainly, I don't think it's the way to understand the original meaning of Hanukkah's Kiddush Hashem. But rather, we're talking about a Kiddush Hashem in which he says, I'm going to live my truth seen through my eyes. And that's a truth not only of me as an individual, but me as a community. And a community is going to make a statement to the public space, and therefore encourage the public space to make space for my individual and my communal truths to be lived out. Now, what is the method you have of spreading that truth, of bringing that kind of truth to light, that particular truth? And it's not necessarily by speeches, as in the book of Maccabees, but rather it is by your personal behavior. And perhaps if we think about the ways in which we want to spread our truths, both in the North American context and in the Israeli context, we have to think about it not necessarily as competition with propaganda and for speeches and spreading the truth, but rather by the example of the way we live. And Maimonides describes it, the Kiddush Hashem, which is Kiddush not in death but in life. V'chein im digdei chacham al atzmo. If the scholar, who already represents Judaism to people because they see the scholar as the representative of Judaism, restrains himself, speaks politely to his fellow man, and when among them acts like one of them and receives them pleasantly, and takes even abuse from them, but never gives abuse to them in return, respects them and even those who do not respect him, etc., etc. It's your personal bearing in the relationship to the people around you, including the people you radically disagree with and the ones who are even persecuting and shaming you. That becomes the source of Kiddush Hashem for Maimonides. On the other hand, and that's the continuation of Maimonides, Chilul Hashem is when you behave in such a way, and unfortunately we have examples of rabbis behaving in that kind of a way, coming out very much in the Me Too campaigns, and certainly having to do with that camera in the mikveh in Washington, D.C., that our behavior is also what creates the Chilul Hashem. It creates that desecration. And so I'd suggest that what Hanukkah is about is not just putting a sign on in your window, these are the values I stand for, hate has no home here, but it's a way of behaving in such a way as we're not influenced by the outside world, but we as individuals become the light to the outside world. Here, I think the Reform Movement curriculum of 1971, which is a children's curriculum, and it's struggling with the issue of how to present Hanukkah. I think they've caught some of the historical truth and certainly a lot of the contemporary truth for what Hanukkah can stand for. And therefore, in source number 8b, along with, I think, a lot of rewriting of the Hanukkah story in ridiculous ways, and yet one piece that I really agree with them is the last line. They say the Jews fought not for equality, but for the right to be different. I think that's true for Matityahu. I think obviously it fits the message that an American Jewish community, after what happened in Pittsburgh, gets reinforced and was reinforced by the whole Pittsburgh community in the non-Jewish community in their support for the Jews in Pittsburgh, was an attempt to say we're fighting for the right to be different. Now what lies behind that is a certain notion of truth. It's a pluralist notion of truth, not a postmodernist, relativist understanding of truth, which says that anybody sees things and everybody sees totally subjectively, and therefore there is no truth, there are no criteria for arguing or discussing your truth, but rather the truth that I learned from David Hartman and that he learned from William James, in which you can never say the whole truth. And I quote here on source number 9, neither the whole of truth or the whole of good is revealed to any single observer, although each observer gains a partial superiority of insight from the particular position in which he stands. There is a standpoint truth. There are truths that I know from my lived experience which are true from that experience. And they have a power of truth. And I want to bring that truth, but I must remember that it's only part of the truth. And I should not presume to regulate the whole rest of the vast field and deny that anybody has another kind of a truth. That's David Hartman's notion of pluralist truth. That's his notion of what the rabbis' insight about the Shiv'im Panim Torah, the multiple faces of what the Torah has to say. And David Hartman always said, and you can see it in number 9, source C, that he said, and here in the bold, you cannot escape the haunting uncertainty of knowing that alternative ways of are religiously viable and authentic. We have a partial truth, and we cannot deny that there are other truths out there that have part of the truth. But that doesn't mean we can't have strong convictions. That doesn't have to mean we don't argue for and struggle for a framework that allows many people to have their partial truths and to see that there's an enormous advantage in listening to other people's partial truths in order to put together a bigger truth, not the truth, but a more comprehensive truth by which we can live together, keeping our right to difference and the value of difference. I end with Rav Kook and his quotation, also a religious philosopher whose mysticism was very much influenced by pluralist understandings. And I quote, everyone must know and understand that within burns a candle, your neshama. There is no one's candle like his or her fellows, and no one lacks their own candle. Everyone must know and understand that it is their task to work to reveal the light of that candle in the public realm and to ignite it until it is a great flame and to illuminate the whole world. Toda Rabah.
Thank you, Noam. That was a remarkable talk, well beyond a discussion of a little bottle of oil that sometimes tends to dominate our Hanukkah conversations. And if I can just begin with a few questions. Before we start, I have a thought from the former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, and to paraphrase him a little bit, he said that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and the light of Hanukkah, as it were, especially for journalists, I'd like to think that light is the best disinfectant, and that one other line, since we did get a little political, one line from Justice Brandeis, who said the most important political office is that of private citizen. Mm-hmm. Now to the questions. We had quite a number of questions sent to us by our viewers, and as well as in advance of the program, as well as during. So this question is from Rabbi Dennis Linson, and he says, when speaking of truth, how do you suggest we reconcile the scholarly history of the period, the Civil War, with the miracle stories when teaching adults and kids about Hanukkah?
Okay. So first of all, as you certainly well know, the miracle stories, at least the miracle story of the Kad Hashem and that burned for 8 days, only appears in rabbinic literature in the Megillat Ta'anit, which is listing various Jewish holidays. It has no basis in the book of Maccabees, which, while not being scholarly, is the, quote, closest historical description we have of the period, written probably about 25 years after the Maccabees have struggled in order to gain their independence. And so the first thing is to see that even with the miracle stories, right, even with the miracle stories, they're never miracles that bring the redemption. This is not Kriyat Yamsuf. We don't split the Red Sea and we're saved by the miracle of God's hand. This is clearly Nisim that were done as we have in Ala Nisim. These are miracles that were done by God functioning through human battles and human fighters. And therefore, that's the real meaning of miracle, I think, within the Hanukkah story for the book of Maccabees itself. And they're aware of the sense that God is with them, even though we don't have a prophet coming down and saying that. Now, the fact that there's a civil war is certainly not hidden from us. I think we need to bring the book of Maccabees back into our celebration of Hanukkah, which is why in the book that we produced with the Hartman Institute, A Different Light, we put in for each night of Hanukkah 8 different pieces from the book of Maccabees so that the story would come back in. The book of Maccabees is, of course, part of the Bible. It's part of the Jewish Bible, but it's part of the Jewish Bible of the Greek-speaking Jews of Egypt, the Septuagint, even if it wasn't ultimately absorbed by the rabbinic Eretz Israel Bible, which is the Masorati text. It certainly had Jewish canonized power. What David Hartman did, he had a wonderful midrash about the miracle that appears in Megillat Ta'anit, the one about the vessel. He said, the miracle of Hanukkah is not that the vessel lasted for 8 days. The miracle is that the Jewish community, knowing that they didn't have enough oil to last for 8 days, nevertheless lit the Ner Tamid in the Mikdash. They lit that light and they started with one, hoping that somehow they would find oil later on. And for David Hartman, that's the notion of the miracle, to believe that we have the power in us when, objectively speaking, we cannot see the end of the darkness, and we cannot see that we have enough powers in order to continue to the end of the battle, that we should still believe in that. And that's why I also think that it's important that Hanukkah is the celebration of the beginning of the battle. In 164 BCE, when Judah the Maccabee reconquered the temple area, he didn't reconquer all of Jerusalem. The Greek troops were still there for another 25 years. They didn't gain political independence. It took them another 24 years before the Maccabees got political independence. And so Hanukkah is about that power to begin a little bit of light without knowing when that light will ever grab all of the public space and enable us to have independence.
Thank you, Noam. As you, in fact, mentioned David Hartman, I just wanted to tell everybody that on the Hartman Institute website, we have recently posted 4 essays about Hanukkah from David Hartman that haven't been seen in years, as we've been starting to go through our archives, finding remarkable treasures that have been hidden in closets and in drawers of the Institute for many years. I have 4 essays from David that that were written in the 80s and the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and they're well worth reading. You can find them by going to the Hartman Institute website. Now, a question from Dr. Susan Igdaloff. Noam, you said you didn't want to interpret the intolerant humanism in today's world, and we're going to leave it to other people, but Dr. Igdaloff says that postmodernists, and this is along the points you raised, postmodernists say that beliefs function as filters that keep reality, if such a thing exists, beyond us. And as we can never access reality, it does no good to describe knowledge or truth in terms of reality. So because there's nothing we can actually say about reality that's meaningful because we cannot access it, can there be a moral universe that transcends individual beliefs?
Great. Postmodernism, in a general sense, is simply a continuation of the original notions of the sophists who challenged the power to have any objective truth. All philosophy, going back to Plato and certainly Aristotle, are always philosophies about the truth which are spoken in response to skeptical points of view. Skepticism is always there. The question is, can I create a notion of truth, the search for truth, the discussion of truth that can be useful in the world even though I have no access to absolute truth? Those people who seek absolute truth are the people are people who either become missionaries who force their truth on everyone else, or they're people who say, if that's what absolute truth is, since we can't prove absolute truth, we're left without any truth at all. And therefore, there can be no fake news because there can be no true news. And what anybody says is always simply their bias in a Nietzschean kind of a way. So what I'd like to suggest is to follow those philosophers who are willing to accept the fact that there's a subjectivity involved in all interpretation without having to go to a radical relativism in which the whole notion of an argument, of a discussion, of a conversation disappears altogether because it loses all of its standards. I think that's one of the areas in which you have people who they talk about it as a pluralist truth or a standpoint truth, or certainly the pragmatism of William James. And so it seems to me that truth doesn't have to be absolute and be accepted by everybody. But if you can bring groups together who disagree on many things, no matter how different those groups are, right-wing and left-wing Zionists, if you will, they actually share a lot of common values. And in fact, because they share some common values, they can have an argument and discussion together. They have to identify those. We don't need an absolute truth. We only need a common set of guidelines for us to have that conversation. I think that's what I Engage is all about. It's about identifying some of the common values and standards we have, and then beginning a discussion in which people will not come to a consensus. There's lots to disagree about, but at least they'll see that they're in the same universe of discourse, and that listening to one another, they begin to see parts of the truth that are hidden from them when they think they have all of the truth and not part of that truth. If we give up on that belief that there are partial truths and there's partial information and evidence, then what we do is we throw out any possibility of solving any issues between groups except by pure force and by the total manipulation of truth, which is what some radical postmodernists are arguing for. And so I'm not worried about the reality as some absolute metaphysical truth, something that Maimonides thought we actually did have access to, but rather I'm interested in the reality as interpreted and lived by human beings. And those realities, those partial truths that we build into community ways of life, I think there are ways to talk among ourselves and to have discussions within those communities and between those communities.
So when Noam mentions iEngage, he's of course referring to the iEngage project, which exists now in the form of several video series, lecture series in many cities across North America, and courses and lectures as well on universities, campuses around, also around North America. So Rabbi Laurie Matskins has a very short question, but I think there's actually quite a lot in it, and it says, how does our fear today compare to the fear of our ancestors, and does it matter?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think that there's really two fears here that we have today very strongly, and they're in deep tension with one another. One of them is the fear that there will be one dominant notion of whatever it means. Could be America, it could mean Israel, and that will choke off the ability of anybody else who has minority positions or alternative positions. And therefore, we want to argue very strongly for a pluralism and a democracy that allows space for that. I think that's one of our great fears of losing that. At the same time, and here I think it's true of the right, both in Israel and in the United States, although I'm not a political analyst, is that there's a tremendous fear, like Matityahu's fear, of losing our traditional way of life. That the pace of change and the pace of integration of different views and different communities into our community is threatening us, that we will not have any public space in which we have room for our public expression for our values. Our taken for granted identity is being threatened. And I think that one of the things that leads to violence, it leads to attempts to take over and to dominate and use government forces to protect the point of view of a part of the community. But I understand it as a real fear. And I'm very much afraid of the left-wing positions, which are so certain that they have the radical left-wing positions, not the liberal democratic ones, the radical left-wing humanist positions that argue that we have a truth, that that's the only truth, that anybody who doesn't live up to that truth has no right to speak whatsoever. You get some of those extreme phenomena on college campuses in which if somebody comes in with an alternative point of view, it's believed to be a mitzvah to silence them because you cannot allow them to speak any kind of truth which we disagree with. That's really the undermining of liberalism, the undermining of a tarbuta machloket, of a rabbinic culture of disagreement. And I'm very much afraid of that group. Of course, with one famous example being the Jewish lesbian who wanted to march in a demonstration in Chicago with a symbol of her Jewish identity as a Magen David, and she wasn't allowed to. But that's only one extreme case of what's happening. And I think that the policing of truth, whether it's the absolutists on the radical left or it's the right-wing groups that want to define this is the true America and this is the true Israel and police those. Either one of those is our great threat. And therefore, we need to be able to create both spaces for a public community to feel safe about their own values expressed in the public realm, but not dominating the public realm. And at the same time, we need space for individuals to share their individual truths with other people.
Well, I guess you couldn't avoid getting political in today's context. So I want to, first of all, say that we have only a few minutes left, and we do not have time to get to all of your questions, but Noam has already told me that he will respond to those questions we've gotten by email. We have email addresses for all the people who sent in questions, and Noam will write to you. So in light of your most recent comment, Noam, and let's try and find a way to end this on a less, shall we say, combative note or a less downbeat note. There's a question from Henry Morgan who says that echoes of the Maccabees are here and now. The Maccabees were extremist zealots. The Hellenists were infidels. So how do we find a way to have collaborative discussions to bring the Jewish people back together, where the disputes are no more severe than they were between Hillel and Shammai, and at least as it says here, at least as he's implying, the disputes between Hillel and Shammai weren't these kind of impossible, there are no other truths available to you, and therefore you must be silent. So can we get back to the days of Hillel and Shammai, at least among the Jewish community?
Mm-hmm. That's a very important question. I think it's related to the previous question about fear. That's something I learned very strongly from David, that as long as people are in fear of the loss of their own identity, then they will be zealots in the defense of that identity. And I want to emphasize that. Unlike the missionary notions that we found in Antiochus IV, and if you look in the appendix to the sources I gave, you'll also find some of the Jewish reflections of that universalist missionary attitude. I think the Maccabees really represented people who wanted to defend the right to their own collective identities. And as long as we feel desperate that anybody who deviates from our truth and our communal truth and we're threatened, then I think we're going to have that intolerance. So the question is, how do we find ways to talk about the people we disagree with in such a way as we're not feeling as if we have delegitimated them? We've said that they're not really Jewish, or they're not humanists, or they're racist. The language of racists and of traitors and of infidels and of zealots is a language which denies us the possibility of talking with other people. And therefore, going back to what I said about Kiddush Hashem in life, I think the way for us to talk to our enemies as well as to our potential people that we can form partial alliances with is by our personal way of living and sending a message of pluralism and tolerance that way. That's much more powerful than our being concerned about how do we delegitimate any other position other than our complete truth.
Thank you, Noam. You've brought a great deal of light to us and a lot of material to think about in the next week. I want to wish everybody a happy Hanukkah in advance. Tell you that our next webinar program will be about Pesach, and you can follow the details of when that will be held on the Hartman website. And today's program will be posted online on our YouTube channel and the Hartman website as soon as we can, and in time for anybody to spend a little more time with it before Hanukkah begins. So from the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, I want to thank you, Noam Zion. I want to thank all of our viewers today, journalists, rabbis, and civilians, as it were, and wish you a happy Hanukkah, and we'll see you again the next time.